Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/Trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Gables, Garridebs, and students all came in 3-packs, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's the difference between a gamekeeper and a gatekeeper? Between a Tregennis and a Tregallis? Between a Jack in office and a Mr. Cocksure?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 339, Boscombe Valley Oddities. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And speaking of oddities, Bert.
That's me.
The oddity couple.
Oh, Felix.
Oh, yes.
Christopher Morley and his brother Felix is the odd couple.
That could be interesting. You know, it seems to me that there could be a potential Trifles episode in the future on odd couples in the canon.
Oh, I like that a lot.
I'll bet if we put our heads to that, we could come up with some interesting people that are paired up that might not seem likely compatriots otherwise.
Oh, that's a great idea. Let's put that on the list.
Yeah, note to self, all right? And note to fans, if we don't produce this episode within, let's say the next 6 weeks, then please
well,
let us know.
Even better, what do you think about that, dear listeners? Send us your suggestions of odd couples in the canon. It's a great, it's really a great topic. You could take it this way or that way, and there are some obvious ones that spring to mind, the noble bachelor being one of them, but let us know what you think.
Bert, I really have to say, even more than I admire your creativity and ingeniousness, I admire your willingness to not do any work.
Yes.
Crowdsource.
Yeah, delegation. If you were more interested in the subject of leadership, you would recognize delegation as it's happening. Intelligent delegation, and we like to call it community and engagement.
There you go.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, if you would like to be an engaged member of the community, simply go to the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/trifles339, all lowercase. You'll find that link in anywhere you happen to be listening to the show, any platform. And please subscribe to us there. It could be on Amazon Music. It could be on YouTube. It could be on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Heck, you could even turn to your smart speaker and say, play the latest episode of Sherlock Holmes Trifles, and you'll get to listen to us wherever you like. But you can also participate as a patron. Just go to our Patreon link in the show notes or simply at patreon.com/trifles. That will allow you to join the community there, where you can listen to the show ad-free and get additional behind-the-scenes cuts and special content as it comes out. And perhaps we'll even poll you there. Great place to get feedback from our most dedicated listeners. Are you one of them? Well, we'd love to hear from you. So go for it. And thank you. Well, we're going to go back to one of the original stories in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the Boscombe Valley Mystery. And I don't believe this is a story that gets enough attention. It's not one of the big headliners like A Study in Scarlet, or I should say from this collection, A Scandal in Bohemia, and The Blue Carbuncle, and The Man with the Twisted Lip. Some of the big ones. I think the Boscombe Valley Mystery kind of gets shoehorned in there, and yet it was a wonderful demonstration of Holmes's skills. And I think a great showcase for a lot of some of the very familiar scenes that have come to personify Holmes and Watson and the Baker Street scene. And
I think you're absolutely right. A showcase is a great word for it, too.
Yeah, and in doing the homework here, Bert, and bravo, I must say, you actually pulled out a number of trifling issues that we wanted to talk about in this show.
A number of folks have been digging into Boscombe Valley Mystery over the years. And it's something that occurred to me when I was looking through some of the monographs and articles and essays over the years written in the great game here. And so we do have a little list of things, and we thought we would talk about them today and see where they go. We did talk about the Boscombe Valley Mystery on a former episode of Trifles back in last November. You probably know the number of that one, where we talked about Nick Utekin's paper suggesting that the conduct of Sherlock Holmes reflected his loss of Irene Adler. But there's a lot more to explore than that.
Yeah, and just for the record, it was, it was episode 307. It was our master's class episode called The Boscombe Valley Mystery. So, but why don't we look at some of those specifics?
Yes.
Because let's recall kind of the timeline of, and I'm not talking necessarily about the chronology, but just the publication timeline of the stories, so we know how this all fits together. In 1887, A Study in Scarlet was brought to our attention via Watson in Mrs. Beeton's Christmas Annual, and that was followed in 1890 by The Sign of Four. And the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes then began to be serialized in the Strand magazine in June of 1891. And as we look across this list, we had a wonderful lineup. The first three stories: A Scandal in Bohemia, The Red-Headed League, A Case of Identity, and then comes the Boscombe Valley Mystery, followed by The Five Orange Pips and The Man with the Twisted Lip. And interestingly, we have a scene here with Watson at home. Watson at home. And this is something that it was referenced in A Scandal in Bohemia as Watson was coming off of his marriage to Mary Morstan from The Sign of Four, the previous story there. And he was visiting Holmes at Baker Street. But here we have Holmes going to see Watson. This is the very first time that this happened. And I guess you could say it is kind of a trifle, but I think it's a really important part in the development of these characters and in the development of the universe that we know as Baker Street.
Yeah, I very much agree. It's interesting too when you look at the beginnings of the cases of Sherlock Holmes, and this is something that we spoke about in the last episode of Trifles when we talked about the beginning of The Man with the Twisted Lip. But this is the first time in this series of adventures that began, as you said, with the Scandal in Bohemia. And the Scandal in Bohemia, takes as read that Watson is speaking to a familiar reader, because as you say, we've had A Study in Scarlet, we've had Sign of Four, and so Scandal in Bohemia begins with an observation by Watson all about the woman. To Sherlock Holmes, she will always be the woman. And then Watson in Scandal in Bohemia says, I've seen little of Holmes lately, my marriage had drifted us away. And then in The Red-Headed League, you have I'd called upon my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, one day in the autumn of last year. So now in the red-headed league case, Watson has popped in. And then in the case of identity, they're in Baker Street. My dear fellow, it begins with Sherlock Holmes speaking. But here in the Boscombe Valley Mystery, Watson is now at home, and this is the first case where we start a case with Watson at home. We were seated at breakfast one morning, my wife and I, when the maid brought in a telegram. It was from Sherlock Holmes and ran in this way. And so here we are at breakfast time. Now we're going to realize in a few minutes that this breakfast was happening pretty late in the day for Watson. So that's one of the odd things about the Boscombe Valley Mystery. But Holmes puts it out. He says, "Have you a couple of days to spare?" So immediately Holmes realizes, or is saying to Watson, this isn't the work of an afternoon. Now, admittedly, they've got to get on a train and go out to the West Midlands, but this is going to take a couple of days. I have just been wired from the west of England in connection with the Boscombe Valley tragedy. And then he says, "She'll be glad if you will come with me. Air and scenery, perfect." So not only has he got a case that's going to take a couple of days, he's also thinking about what a great thing to do to get out of London and see this air and scenery, which is a little unusual. Leaving Paddington by the 11:15.
I love how Holmes is acting as travel agent there. Can I interest you in a couple of days away at the beach? We got a lovely villa for you. The scenery is great. The sea air, that kind of thing. He's really trying to sell it to Watson here.
Yeah. But isn't that interesting? He's seated at breakfast one morning with his wife, and and then Mary speaks. "What do you say, dear? Will you go?" So it sounds like she's got him halfway out the door already. And Watson hasn't been thinking about Sherlock Holmes. He says, "Well, I don't know what to say by way of reply. I have a fairly long list at present." And this is another oddity, because now Watson occasionally tells us his practice, is not booming along. But boy, oh boy, here he has a long list. And then Mary says, "Oh, Anstruther would do your work for you." So she's sending him, she's already providing the answer. "You have been looking a little pale lately. I think a change would do you good." And you're always so interested in Mr. Sherlock Holmes's cases.
Well, a few things jump out to me there. One is, what a kind and understanding wife Mary Watson was. To know her husband as she did, obviously she knows that Sherlock Holmes is the reason the two of them were brought together as a couple, but she understands Watson's wandering heart, as it were. A man who thrived on adventure, a man who, as Watson tells us here, could be ready very quickly to jump into action, as his war experience in Afghanistan trained him. His experience of camp life, he said, had at least the effect of making me a prompt and ready traveler. My wants were few and simple, so that in less than the time stated, I was in a cab with my valise rattling away to Paddington Station. And he says he only had a half hour to spare. Now, as you say, the telegram from Holmes said leave Paddington by the 11:15. Watson only had a half hour to spare. That means Watson and his wife are sitting at the breakfast table at about 10:30. That's a late breakfast. And here's the thing that troubles me, and maybe we can resolve it here. Watson is lounging the morning away, having a very leisurely breakfast with his wife as late as 10:30, and yet he just finished telling us, "Oh, I don't know what to say. I have a fairly long list at present." Was he really that busy that he was having such a late breakfast?
Yeah, isn't that peculiar? Now you could say, well, of course, because of his long list and his patient load, Watson had obviously had a case the evening before and probably gotten in very late. But you could also say he was out at the club playing billiards with Thurston. That now that his checkbook isn't locked up in Sherlock Holmes' bureau, he's been investing in South African securities. I mean, who knows what he's been doing?
Oh, that's interesting because maybe this is a ruse, a blind for Watson's gambling habits, and his wife thinks she can divorce him of the habit by getting him out of town for a few days and getting him away from the evil influence of his gambling buddies in town.
Oh, well, now see, there's a very good idea.
Yeah.
How about that?
What I was going to say is maybe Watson had some early morning rounds that he went on and simply returned to home and had a late breakfast after doing some morning medical work.
Oh, I like that. That is much more reasonable.
We'll give him the benefit of the doubt that way.
Yeah, I like that. That's good.
Well, let's give our listeners a benefit of the doubt by turning things over to our sponsor, and we'll be back after this quick word. In 2023, the BSI Press has added more titles to its roster that you won't want to miss. First up this year is the latest in the BSI Manuscript series, a title that takes you, well, maybe a moment to connect to the story, The Haven Horror. If you guessed The Adventure of the Retired Colorman, you're more clever than Josiah Amberley. This manuscript, once owned by Dame Jean Conan Doyle and bequeathed to the British Museum, is a very clean one, coming as it did at the conclusion of the canon. But the essays that accompany it are wonderfully informative. Dan Andriaco looks at prostheses in the canon. The BSI's resident toxicologist Marina Stayich brings us into the realm of poisons. And our own Bert Wolder tells about the life of the artist Frank Wiles. These and more are colorful, just as colorful as the original story that acted as a metaphor and reality, and it treats the reader to a kaleidoscope of shades and hues that will provide hours of reading pleasure. Be sure to get your copy of The Haven Horror before it's sold out at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. All right, we're back looking at some of the oddities in the Boscombe Valley Mystery. What else came to your mind, Bert, as you were mulling this topic over?
Well, there's a large number of things, but one of the most interesting, at least that occurred to me, was who was the client here? Because what we have, of course, there are just a number of things. So, for example, on the way to the client, Watson is at Paddington. He sees Holmes. We have this great description of Holmes in his close-fitting cloth cap and his traveling cloak. But he then, after he meets Watson at the train, Holmes then goes to procure the tickets, which I thought was interesting. Holmes, meanwhile, he says to Watson in his telegram, I was just wired on this particular tragedy. He's now collected the papers. He's collected lots of papers, including local papers, and he's brought them all with him to the train. So, one of the questions is, sort of how Holmes has spent his morning. But in any case, there they are in Paddington. And when they're on the train, they have a conversation in which Holmes begins to share. He goes through the newspapers. He has moments of meditation and note-taking. And then they have a conversation where Holmes relates the details and the facts of the case and has a lovely quotation about circumstantial evidence being very tricky. But in that conversation, he says, it must be confessed that the case looks exceedingly grave against this young man, McCarthy, and it's very possible he's indeed the culprit. There are several people in the neighborhood, however, and among them Miss Turner, the daughter of the neighboring landowner, who believe in his innocence and who have retained Lestrade. Retained Lestrade. Now, there's a number of things going on there, but in any case, to conclude that sentence, Holmes then identifies Lestrade to Watson. You may remember him in connection with Study in Scarlet. Lestrade, being rather puzzled, has referred the case to me. And but this question of retaining Lestrade, people have written about this over the years. One of the observations that was made by, I think it was Peter Weller, members of the Metropolitan Police Force could act as agents for private organizations and individuals. Under the Metropolitan Police Act of 1839, policemen could be employed privately, provided that all their costs were borne by those using their services.
Okay.
So it's possible that, Lestrade has been retained by this group of people, including Miss Turner. But when we get to the actual location of the crime and to the hotel and so on, and to the first conversations between Lestrade and Watson and Holmes, Miss Turner will make an appearance, and it's clear that she knows Sherlock Holmes. And so if she knows of Sherlock Holmes, why wasn't he retained to begin with? At that point, she's fairly disappointed with Lestrade. But it's this question here of who was the client. And of course, interestingly, when you get into this, who is the client, you have to ask who paid the fee. Lestrade certainly isn't going to pay Sherlock Holmes a fee, I don't think.
That's a good question. It could be a friend of the family. It could be James Turner. That's true. Her betrothed.
Well, they're not betrothed yet.
Well,
wait a minute.
Her intended, shall we say?
No,
I'm sorry, that's James Turner. James McCarthy.
McCarthy, right?
Yeah.
And he's apparently an idiot, which we might get to.
True. So I don't know that he would have had the wit to do that, but it does raise an interesting point.
Yeah, who's the client? Who pays the bill at the end for the the train tickets and so on and so forth, and hopefully Sherlock Holmes compensation. Interesting.
Right. Well, it's fascinating.
And it could be that there was no investigation. Someone has pointed this out over the years. It could be that there was no criminal investigation department, and that somebody approached the chief constable to ask for the assistance of the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah.
And that Lestrade got sent down. But the word there is retained. They've retained Lestrade.
Yeah.
Not that he's been assigned to the case, not that he's responded, but he's been retained. Interesting.
Well, let's move on to another trifling issue here. And, recall that in the telegram, Holmes was enticing Watson to join him. He said, "Shall be glad if you will come with me." So, other than Sherlock Holmes's happiness, what does Watson do to make himself useful in this particular story?
Well, that's a great question. Here's poor Dr. Watson, who now has a long list, who gets this telegram at around 10:30 in the morning, and 45 minutes later is on the platform at Paddington, and goes out to the West Midlands, which we learn is it's a considerable train ride. They get there and so on. Watson doesn't seem to do very much at all. He doesn't get to go to the place where I think he's at the Assizes, isn't Turner at the Assizes?
Yeah, I believe so.
But in any case, Lestrade only has permission for himself and Holmes to go and see Turner. And so what we will learn about Turner is what Holmes comes back and tells Watson. So Watson occupies some time by reading a yellowback novel, which he then hates and throws across the room. He reviews what he knows about the injury on the head of the murdered man and marks it on his own head. So he comes to some conclusions that he tells us about that, which tends to support Holmes's observation also later about the fact that the murderer must have been left-handed. But other than that, Watson smokes a cigar at Holmes's request and listens to him. Listens to him as he explains everything he's been thinking about.
Well, and let's. I'm trying to think as they go through this. I mean, part of me just cynically wants to say that Holmes brought Watson along simply to document the case. But by the time we get to the conclusion, where Turner makes his confession, there's an important role that Watson does play here. He makes his statement. He says he's a dying man, that he's had diabetes. It's, whether he's going to live a month or two is really the issue. His doctor doesn't give him long. And then Holmes rose and sat down at the table with his pen in his hand and a bundle of paper before him. And he said, "Just tell us the truth. I shall jot down the facts. You will sign it, and Watson here can witness it. Then I could produce your confession at the last extremity to save young McCarthy." So it was kind of an insurance policy, as it were, that Holmes had Watson there to act as a legal witness to a document.
Oh, that is interesting. Yeah, he's brought with him. I didn't pay any attention to that. That is a terrific observation.
But that's it. That's Watson's only function, other than being a witness to the entire story playing out.
Yes, it's true. But Watson also plays an important role before they even leave London. Watson keeps the two corner seats while Holmes goes to get the tickets. Yeah.
Well, hey.
Basically, Holmes says to Watson, "It's really very good of you to come. I really appreciate having somebody to talk to," basically. But what he says is, "It makes a considerable difference to me having someone with me on whom I can thoroughly rely. Local aid is always either worthless or biased. And keep the two corner seats while I get the tickets."
On whom I can thoroughly rely. I mean, isn't that a wonderful descriptor for Watson in Holmes's life? I mean, every time he needed him, he was there, with the exception of abandoning Holmes for a wife. That only selfish moment.
Right. Well, Watson also provides another really important role in the case. And of course, we've talked about this from time to time. Watson's presence, of course, in the cases of Sherlock Holmes is to serve as an embodiment of the reader who's trying to make sense of all this. And right before the denouement, Holmes is explaining to Watson the observations he made that led to some of his deductions. And Watson says, "Holmes, you have drawn a net round this man from which he cannot escape, and you have saved an innocent human life as truly as if you had cut the cord which was hanging him. I see the direction in which all this points. The culprit is..." And then what happens next is, "Mr. John Turner," cried the hotel waiter, opening the door of our sitting room and ushering in a visitor. And that, of course, is just a wonderful narrative stroke here, with Watson saying, "The culprit is Mr. John Turner," says the hotel waiter. That's just lovely.
I'm trying to remember. There's some comedy. I know what it is. It's that scene in A History of the World Part 1 when it's the Last Supper and Mel Brooks is the waiter, right? And John Hurt is Jesus. He's going around and he says, "Yea, yea, so you say. On this night, one of you will betray me." "No, master, who is it?" And Mel Brooks goes, "Judas, would you like to try the wine?"
Oh, yes.
Well, all of these things are just trifles, but before we wrap this episode up, we do have a little bit of trifling business to take care of ourselves. It is the end of the month. It's the end of the quarter. We have two drawings to have here. One is for a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. The other is for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. And all of our Patreon supporters are eligible to participate in this particular drawing. So why don't we pull out the big prize wheel and give it a spin as it goes around, landing randomly on number 3, a low one. And this is for the back issue of the Baker Street Journal, and that goes to R.W. Lovejoy. All right, R.W. We will send a note to you and make sure that you are you're informed that we have your address so we can send you that back issue of the journal. Let's give it another spin again and see who comes up this time for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. Number 48, and that looks like it is Antonio Mangione. Hooray! Congratulations. A couple of nice wins there for RW and Antonio. Thank you. And if for anyone else, if you'd like to participate in this, we're doing this all year long. So all you have to do to become a patron for as little as $1 a month is simply go to patreon.com/trifles and stick in your pledge there and poke around. Let's see if we can get some more conversation going with our Patreon community there. Would love to hear from you folks and would love to give away more Baker Street Journal stuff.
Hear, hear.
Well, Bert, anything else to add about the Boscombe Valley Mystery before we round out the show here?
Oh, there's endless things to talk about. Particularly how did Holmes clear McCarthy without using Turner's confession? How did he work all that out? But it's just part of the continuing joy of walking through and talking about and thinking about the cases of Sherlock Holmes in new ways. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
It has been a case of considerable interest.